Saturday, April the 26th, 1913, in Atlanta, Georgia, a night watchman, Newt Lee, was doing his rounds at 4 a.m. when he makes the grim discovery of the body of 13-year-old Mary Fagan in the basement. She'd been cruelly raped and strangled, and her body badly battered. She had worked at the factory since she was 10 and was one of 100 or so young girls who toiled 55 hours a week at the National Pencil Factory. But she had been laid off the previous Monday due to a material shortage. On the Friday, around lunchtime, she had gone to the office to collect her pay packet from the factory manager, 29-year-old Leo Frank. He was the last known person to see her alive. Lee immediately called the police, who observed a young girl's body so covered in dirt that they had trouble ascertaining that the victim was white. Her face was blood-stained, blackened and scratched, and her head was bruised and battered. Cord was tied in a loop around her neck, showing that she had been strangled. Her skin was covered with dust from the floor, showing to first responding officers that she and her assailant had struggled on the ground. A service ramp at the rear of the basement led to a sliding door that opened into an alley, and it was found that this door had been tampered with, so it could be opened without unlocking it. Later, a metal bar that had been used was found. Some of the evidence at the crime scene was improperly handled by the police investigators. A trail in the dirt on the floor, along which police believe Fagan had been dragged from a service lift, was trampled, and any footprints were never identified. 2 handwritten notes were found in a pile of rubbish by the body's head and became known as the murder notes. One read, "He said he would love me. Lamb down play like the night witch did it, but that long tall black Negro did boy hisself." The other said, "Ma'am, that Negro hired down here did this. I went to make water, and he pushed me down that hole. That was tall. I right well play with me." The phrase night witch was thought to mean night watchman. When the notes were initially read aloud, Lee, who was black, said, "Boss, it looks like they are trying to lay it on me." The 2 notes were made to look as if Fagan had written them. Based on the mention of a night witch, they implicated the night watchman, Newt Lee. Over the course of their investigations, the police arrested several men, including Lee, Frank, and Jim Conley, a caretaker at the factory. Conley was arrested that morning based on these notes and his apparent familiarity with the body, since he stated that the girl was white when the police, because of the filth and darkness in the basement, initially thought she was black. The events that followed, a fraught trial and conviction, the commutation of the death sentence, and the accused extrajudicial demise, fanned by racist undercurrents, which polarized Atlanta, became one of Georgia's most notorious crimes. The public demanded quick action and swift justice. Mary Fagan was born on June the 1st, 1899, into a Georgia family of tenant farmers. Her father died before she was born. Shortly after Mary's birth, her mother, Frances Fagan, moved the family to East Point in southwest Atlanta, where she opened a boarding house. Fagan left school at age 10 to work part-time in a textile mill. In 1912, after her mother married John Coleman, the family moved into the city of Atlanta. That spring, Fagan took a job with the National Pencil Company, where she earned 10 cents an hour operating a knurling machine that inserted the metal tips onto the pencils. She worked in a room across the hallway from Leo Frank's office. He was born into a German Jewish family in April 1884 and brought up in New York, and attended university gaining a degree at Cornell in mechanical engineering. After graduating in 1906, he worked briefly as a draftsman and as a testing engineer. At the invitation of his uncle, Moses Frank, Leo traveled to Atlanta for 2 weeks in late October 1907 to meet a delegation of investors for a position with the National Pencil Company, a business in which Moses was a major shareholder. Frank accepted the position and traveled to Germany to study pencil manufacturing at the Eberhard Faber Pencil Factory. After a 9-month apprenticeship, he returned to the United States and began working at the National Pencil Company in August 1908, becoming manager of the factory the following month, earning $108 a month, plus a share of the factory's profits. He was introduced to Lucille Selig shortly after he arrived in Atlanta. She came from a prominent upper-middle-class Jewish family of industrialists who, 2 generations earlier, had founded the first synagogue in the city. They married in November 1910. Frank described his married life as happy and involved himself with the city's Jewish community. At that time, there were growing concerns regarding child labor at factories. One of these was Mary Fagan. Although the southern United States was not specifically known for its anti-Semitism, Frank's northern culture and Jewish faith added to the sense that he was different in some way. After the discovery of the body, both Newt Lee and the police unsuccessfully tried to telephone Frank. He was contacted later that morning, and he agreed to accompany them to the factory. When they arrived shortly after 7 a.m., without telling the specifics of what had happened, Frank seemed extremely nervous, trembling and pale. He said he was not familiar with the name Mary Fagan and would need to check his payroll book. The detectives took him to the crime scene and walked through the entire building. At this point, Frank was not considered a suspect. On Monday, April the 28th, Frank, accompanied by his lawyer, Luther Rosser, gave a written statement to the police that provided a brief timeline of his activities on Saturday. He said Fagan was in his office between 12:05 and 12:10 p.m., that Lee had arrived at 4 p.m., but was asked to return later. Frank explained that Lee's time card for Sunday morning had several gaps, as he was supposed to punch in every half hour. That had been missed when he discussed the time card with police on Sunday. Frank had no cuts or injuries, and the police found no blood on the suit that he said he had worn, or bloodstains on clothing at Frank's house. Conley was arrested on the 1st of May, being now a suspect. N.V. Darley and Harry Scott of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency were hired to investigate the case and prove his innocence. The Pinkertons would investigate many leads, ranging from crime scene evidence to allegations of sexual misconduct on the part of Frank. They were required to submit duplicates of all evidence to the police, including any that damaged Frank's case. Unknown to him was Scott's close ties with the authorities, particularly his best friend, Detective John Black, who believed in Frank's guilt from the outset. The agency quickly became disillusioned with the many societal implications of the case, most notably the notion that Frank was possibly able to evade prosecution due to his being a rich Jew, buying off the police and paying for private detectives. He was subsequently arrested. The police had no single development that had persuaded them that Leo Frank had murdered Mary Fagan. Instead, the cumulative weight of suspicions and misgivings had tipped the scales against the manager. The police were convinced Lee was involved as Frank's accomplice and that Frank was trying to implicate him. The state governor, noting the reaction of the public to press sensationalism soon after Lee's and Frank's arrests, organized militias in case they were needed to repulse mob action against the prisoners. The trial, starting on July the 28th, 1913, at Fulton County Court, was long and complicated, being fiercely contested by both the prosecution and the defense legal teams. It was an all-male white jury. Public opinion was demanding justice, and proceedings were overshadowed by racist views towards the Jewish and black defendants. The prosecution's strategy played on prejudices of the white 1900s Georgia population, such as that a black man could not have been intelligent enough to make up a complicated story. The prosecution's theory was that Frank was the murderer and that the so-called murder notes had been dictated by Frank to Conley in an effort to pin the crime on Newt Lee. The defense's theory was that Conley was the killer. The team hoped to prove that Frank's schedule the day of the murder made it impossible for him to commit the crime, that he had no relationship with the murder victim, and that he did not pursue girls in his employ. More importantly, they wanted to discredit Jim Conley. During the trial, public sentiment turned against Frank. The jurors were intimidated by the hostility inside and outside the courtroom, and the defense asked for, but was denied a mistrial. The prosecution relied heavily on the testimony of Conley, who described himself as an accomplice in the aftermath of the murder, and who the defense argued was, in fact, the actual killer. It was disclosed that Frank had a penchant for seeing young women for extracurricular activities in his office on a regular basis, these antics being aided by Conley, the factory caretaker, and the prosecution zoned in on this fact. On the day of the murder, Conley, the caretaker, said he saw Fagan go upstairs, from where he heard a scream coming shortly after. He alleged that Frank called him and showed him Fagan's body, admitting that he had hurt her, adding that he and Frank took the body to the basement via the elevator, before returning to the office where Frank dictated the murder notes. Conley was cross-examined by the defense for 16 hours over 3 days, and never changed his story. The defense called a number of factory girls who testified that they had never seen Frank flirting with or touching the girls, and that they considered him to be of good character. The prosecution, not being deterred on this point, called a group of former female factory workers to ask them the question, "Do you know Mr. Frank's character for lasciviousness?" The answers were usually yes. It had been ascertained that Fagan died between 12 and 12:15 p.m. A prosecution witness, Montine Stover, said she had gone into the office to get her pay, waiting there from 12:05 to 12:10, and did not see Frank in his office. The prosecution's theory was that Stover did not see Frank because he was at that time murdering Fagan in the metal room. Stover's account did not match that of Frank's, that he had not left the office between noon and 12:30. Other testimony indicated that Fagan got off the tram between 12:07 and 12:10. From the stop, it was around 2 to 4 minutes walk, suggesting that Stover arrived first, showing that Frank could not be killing Fagan because at the time she had not yet arrived. The police theorized that Conley had followed another employee into the building, intending to rob her, but found Fagan was an easier target. There was no explanation for the failure to locate Fagan's handbag that other witnesses had testified she carried that day. They were also concerned that Conley did not mention that he was aware crime had been committed when he wrote the notes, suggesting Frank had simply dictated them to Conley arbitrarily. Conley said he and Frank took the body to the basement via the elevator, then returned to Frank's office, where the murder notes were dictated. Conley had a prior criminal record, and his testimony had discrepancies in it that were different to the statements of other witnesses, and he admitted to moving the body, claiming Frank had coerced him. On August the 25th, it took the jury an hour and 45 minutes to unanimously convict Frank of murder. The following day, the judge sentenced him to death by hanging. The sentence was scheduled to be carried out on October the 10th, 1913. The case attracted national press attention, and many deemed the conviction a travesty. Within Georgia, this criticism fueled anti-Semitism and hatred towards Frank. The following year, on February the 24th, 1914, Conley was sentenced to a year in jail for being an accomplice after the fact to Fagan's murder. Under Georgia law at the time, appeals of death penalty cases had to be based on errors of law, not a re-evaluation of the evidence presented at trial. The defense cited 115 procedural problems, and the application resulted in a stay of execution. On October the 31st, the appeal was turned down. Prison letters Conley wrote to a friend, Annie Carter, were discovered. The defense said that these, along with Carter's testimony, implicated Conley as the actual murderer. The judge denied Frank a new trial on November the 14th, 1914, as the due process issue should have been raised earlier, characterizing what it considered a belated effort as trifling with the court. The appeals process was escalated to the Georgia Supreme Court on December the 15th, suggesting that the trial had not been fair and had been prejudiced by the public's pressure and negative newspaper coverage. By mid-February the following year, the appeal and a request for a new trial was denied. The execution was set for April the 17th, 1915, but was postponed as an application for a commutation of Frank's death sentence was submitted to a 3-person prison commission in Georgia. It was rejected on June the 9th by a vote of 2-1. The dissenter indicated that he felt it was wrong to execute a man on the testimony of an accomplice when the circumstances of the crime tend to fix the guilt upon the accomplice. The application then passed to Governor John Slatton, whose term would end 4 days after Frank's scheduled execution. He opened hearings on June the 12th. In addition to receiving presentations from both sides with new arguments and evidence, Slatton visited the crime scene and reviewed over 10,000 pages of documents, and he received more than 1,000 death threats. During the hearing, former Governor Joseph Brown warned Slatton, "In all frankness, if you wish to invoke lynch law in Georgia and destroy trial by jury, the way to do it is by retrying this case and reversing all the courts." On June the 21st, Slatton released the order to commute Frank's murder conviction to life imprisonment. His legal rationale was that there was sufficient new evidence not available at the original trial to justify Frank's actions. He also told reporters that he was certain that Conley was the actual murderer, and privately told friends that he would have issued a full pardon if not for his belief that Frank would soon be able to prove his own innocence. The public was outraged. A mob threatened to attack Slatton at his home. A detachment of the Georgia National Guard, along with county policemen and a group of Slatton's friends who were sworn in as deputies, dispersed the mob. He had been a popular governor, but he and his wife left Georgia for good soon after. For Frank's protection, he was taken to the Mill Edgeville State Penitentiary in the middle of the night before the commutation was announced. The prison was well guarded and separated from the city by 150 miles of mostly unpaved road. But on July the 17th, the New York Times reported that fellow inmate William Crean tried to kill Frank by slashing his throat with a 7-inch knife. Crean told authorities he wanted to keep the other inmates safe from mob violence. Frank's presence was a disgrace to the prison, and that he was sure he would be pardoned if he killed Frank. Not long after Frank had moved prisons, A group of leading citizens from Marietta, in Cobb County, close to Mary Fagan's hometown, formulated a plan to deliver the justice they felt had been denied. By June the 21st, commutation of the sentence provoked a popular call advocating Frank's lynching. A newspaper wrote that this country has nothing to fear from its rural communities. Lynch law is a good sign. It shows that a sense of justice lives among the people. A group of politically well-connected and socially prominent men organized themselves into the Vigilance Committee and openly planned to kidnap Frank from prison. They consisted of 28 men with various skills. An electrician was to cut the prison wires. Car mechanics were to keep the cars running, and there was a locksmith, a telephone man, a medic, a hangman, and a lay preacher. The ringleaders were well known locally. The list included Joseph Brown, a former governor of Georgia, Eugene Clay, former mayor of Marietta and later president of the Georgia Senate, E.P. Dobbs, mayor of Marietta at the time, Moultrie Sessions, lawyer and banker, part of the Marietta delegation at Governor Slatton's clemency hearing, several current and former Cobb County sheriffs, along with other individuals of various professions. On the afternoon of August the 16th, with prison officials having been paid off to look the other way, 8 cars of the lynch mob left Marietta separately for Midgedgeville. They arrived at the prison at around 10 p.m. The electrician cut the telephone wires, and members of the group drained the petrol from the prison's cars, handcuffed the warden, seized Frank, and drove away. The trip back took about 7 hours through small towns on back roads. Lookouts telephoned ahead to the next town as soon as they saw the line of cars pass by. A large oak tree at Frey's Gin, 2 miles east of Marietta, had been prepared, complete with a rope. The New York Times reported Frank was handcuffed, his legs tied at the ankles, and that he was hung from a branch of the tree at around 7 a.m., facing the direction of the house where Fagan had lived. Within an hour, a crowd of around 1,000 men, women, and children arrived on foot, in cars, and on horses, and that souvenir hunters cut away parts of Frank's shirt sleeves and wanted to have the body cut into pieces and burned, and began to run around, screaming and whipping up the mob. Judge Morris tried to restore order and asked for a vote on whether the body should be returned to the parents intact. Only one person disagreed, and when the body was cut down, started stomping on Frank's face and chest. The body was put in a car and driven away quickly. In Atlanta, thousands besieged the undertakers, demanding to see the body. After the mob began breaking window panes, they were allowed to file past the remains. Around 15,000 people were estimated to have looked at Frank's body, which the police guarded for fear of further violence. The corpse was transported by rail from Atlanta to New York and buried at the Mount Carmel Cemetery in Glendale on August the 20th, 1915. The New York Times reported that the residents of Cobb County believed the lynch mob prevented a miscarriage of justice and has stepped in to uphold the law after Governor Slatton arbitrarily set it aside. A grand jury was convened to indict the lynchers. Although they were well known locally, none were identified, and some of the lynchers may have served on the very same grand jury that was investigating them. Nat Harris, the newly elected governor who succeeded Slatton, promised to punish the mob, issuing a $1,500 state reward for information. It was apparent that the citizens of Marietta would die rather than reveal their knowledge or even their suspicion of the identities of the lynchers. Doubtless, they could be apprehended, but they never were, as they had covered up their actions, and no one was arrested or prosecuted. Photographs were taken of the lynching, which were published and sold as postcards in local shops for 25 cents each. Newspapers throughout Georgia condemned the events, as did the national press, who also denounced the culture in Georgia and the entire South. 1 month after the lynching, there was a call for a revival of the notoriously racially violent and anti-Semitic Ku Klux Klan, the hooded fraternity of horsemen that had been disbanded in 1869, whose midnight rides, cross burnings, and ferocious attacks against African Americans had terrorized the South. In November 1915, at the top of Stone Mountain outside Atlanta, a group of men lit a giant pitch and kerosene-soaked wooden cross, signaling the return of the organization that had first been established by Confederate veterans to protect the Southern way of life in the aftermath of the Civil War. By the late 1930s, in the far West and Midwest, lynchings claimed victims who were white, Mexican, American Indian, and African American. In the South, the victims were largely black. Most lynchings were spontaneous, as the victims were never tried in a court of law. They were public spectacles, with the faces of members of the lynch party and the crowd captured in photographs. The consensus today is that Frank was wrongly convicted and that Mary Fagan was the target of a robbery for her wage packet, probably by Conley. Was justice derailed when both the sentence to hang and its commutation to life imprisonment by Georgia's governor was overthrown by a vigilante lynch mob? If, as Governor John Slatton and many others believed, there was reasonable doubt about Frank's guilt and that he might have been falsely accused, then someone else murdered Mary Fagan. If that is the case, then the true killer was never caught. In 1986, the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Paroles issued a pardon in recognition of the state's failures, including to protect Frank and to preserve his opportunity to appeal, but took no stance on his guilt or innocence.